So last time I looked at Projects, which is one of the most powerful sets of Dominion, and today I'm looking at Prosperity, which is one of the weakest at this point. Um, let's get started. Our first card here is going to be Royal Seal. Yeah, Royal Seal in the D tier. It's unfortunately just not a very strong card. The effect in itself isn't terrible, being able to top deck anything that you gain or purchase. Unfortunately, this is a 5 cost card, and it only offers 2 coin in addition to this effect. And there are way better top deckers out there. Just for instance, Tracker only costs 2, and basically does the same thing as this. So yeah, it's not particularly good. If it didn't cost 5, it might be a little bit better, but honestly, still, you probably wouldn't buy it very often. All right, next up, Contraband. Oh, where is Contraband? Ah, here it is. Contraband also in the D tier. Got a little bit of a buff with events and projects and other stuff like that. There's probably something I'm forgetting, but mostly because someone can't name them. But at the end of the day, like often this card is just kind of risky to get. It's 3 coins in a buy, so it's only better than gold if there are lots of options on the board that you want to get, and you don't mind your opponent blocking one of them. And it happens relatively often that you can at least make use of this, but it's not really a true plus buy in a way because you can't really use it in the late game the way you probably would like to. It's very rare that you're going to be able to use Contraband for greening. You're probably going to have to get rid of it at that point in the game, or be very, very crafty with how you handle in game. And I think that's one of the big problems with this card. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice that it only costs 5 instead of 6. And there are times when I pull this one out, but often you just end up ignoring it because it's just too risky to give your opponent buying decision power. Next is Counting House. So for what it does, Counting House is actually pretty cool. It takes all the copper in your discard, puts it in your hand. And, there's some decent combos that go with this. Of course, Traveling Fair Counting House is really, really powerful. It's one of the best combos in the game. And there's some other ones like Night Watchman with Counting House that are decently strong as well. But I think on most boards, you're going to just completely ignore this card. It's just not worth setting up. If you draw it at the top of your shuffle, it's so very bad that you need like some kind of assurance that you're not going to do that. And it's actually harder to guarantee you draw something late in a shuffle than it is early. So yeah, Counting House is just more often than not going to be great. Plus, copper is a bad card to begin with, and you're usually trying to get rid of it. So yeah, usually that's going to be more powerful than whatever you could do with Counting House. It's not that it doesn't have its spots, but most of the time you completely ignore it. So it's D tier. Next card on the list is a card a lot of people love, but unfortunately just isn't very good, and that's Venture. Yeah, Venture, people will always cite like, hey, it's so cool. Like you can just venture into a venture and then play another treasure, but you're still only getting 1 coin per venture. It's just not very good. You're paying 5 for this thing, and it's got a cute little gimmick, but it doesn't draw you cards. It doesn't give you a buy or anything particularly useful. The cards that it's hitting are better than the venture itself, and often you'd rather just have those cards in your deck. So, I mean, it's not entirely without purpose, and I do occasionally get Venture, and I do think it's a fun card, but I think it's very weak, especially at the price of 5. It's not something you're going to want to be getting very often, and you can safely ignore it most of the time. I think Silver very frequently is better than Venture, which is sad, to say the least. Next, D tier card. There's a lot of D in this set. Trade Route, one of the worst trashers in the game. If you get it early in the game, which is when you want to thin, it doesn't give you anything but that plus buy, which is next to useless at the start. Late in the game, it gets a bit more powerful, but you might not have that much junk to get rid of. And there's also no guarantee your opponent's going to help you empty the green piles so that you can actually get Trade Route buffed up. And you really don't want to get green cards early in the game to make it more powerful. So yeah, like it's just a card that's got all kinds of problems. It's cheap, and that's the nicest thing going for it, but it's among the worst trashers in the game for sure. All right, spicy hot take incoming. Vault is also D tier. I'm really, really unimpressed by Vault. I think there are a couple of combos that you can do with it. Like there's Double Tactician, and we've got Grand Market. Of course, combos pretty nicely with it. But a whole lot of the time, this card is pretty close to useless. I mean, yeah, it's plus 2 cards for 5. It's got this discard effect where you get coins for everything you discard, and occasionally that's nice. All right, if you got a lot of junk in your deck, but you don't want a lot of junk in your deck, and you probably don't want to discard most of the cards that are in your deck in most games. It's pretty rare that you're actually getting value out of Vault, I think. Unless you can redraw the cards. But even that, I think, is relatively rare. Like it could work with Draw to X every now and then, but it's a niche scenario. Even more than that, Vault gives your opponent this chance to discard 2 cards and draw 1, and sometimes that can be really helpful to them. So you're playing this not so great card at a penalty, and I think that makes Vault pretty bad. Now, it's obviously more useful than the things I put below it because it can give you all that coin, but yeah, I think it's a relatively weak card. And yeah, I'm just going to stick it in the D tier. Next up is Horde, and yeah, we'll move up to the C tier for Horde. So Horde lets you gain golds when you buy victory cards. That's pretty nice. Gold's not a bad card to have, and if you want lots of them for some reason, like I don't know, maybe there's a landmark, or maybe you want to trash the gold, or maybe you just need extra money. Like this is one way to accumulate payload. The only problem is you're adding an extra stop card to your deck. And since you're already buying a stop card, unless it's an alt victory card, that means Horde is slowing your deck down quite a bit. So you need to have a deck that can actually handle buying lots of green, okay? Which is either like a strong money deck or it's an engine that's really, really cooking. And usually you don't want to add Horde to something like that. So it finds itself in a little bit of a dilemma there sometimes. And so I'll end up ignoring it. But often, not often, but every now and then I do get Horde and it does pay off. So yeah, I think it's okay. It's C tier. Next is Bank. Bank, where's Bank? Ah, here it is. Bank is a really cool payload card. Every treasure in play, you get 1 coin, including the bank itself. Very weak if you're not drawing big hands. Pretty strong if you are drawing big hands and have lots of treasure. It's pretty good. There's not much to say about it, though. One thing that's cool about it is it costs 7, so sometimes you can do stuff like upgrade a bank. And stacking banks, that can be pretty strong because each one that you play is a little bit stronger than the last one. But you really do need a lot of draw to get all of those treasures into play. And usually treasure cards don't draw, so a bit of a dilemma there. Still, I think it can be a very good payload. Well worth considering when it's in the kingdom. C tier nonetheless, because I think it's worth ignoring more often than it is buying. Do I really feel that way about it? I guess. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, do I want to put it up higher? I don't think so. I think C tier. C tier. Next is Monument, which I'll also put at the C tier. It's not horrible. Okay, you get 2 coins and you get a victory point, but it's awfully slow. And unless you have a card that lets you play Monument a whole lot, in which case it can be very strong. Like King's Court is there as an option. Most of the time, though, it's cool getting that extra victory point, but you sure would like to be getting some better effects when you're playing your cards, especially early in the game. Those victory points really don't do anything for you until the very end. Monument is just a little bit weak throughout most of the game. There are, of course, very powerful decks you could build, like minion decks and stuff like that play lots of monuments, and it can be pretty strong in those cases, but I think most of the time it's just okay. It's often totally skippable. Talisman also goes in the C tier. It's got a pretty neat effect, actually. You buy a card and you get another copy of it, but it only works with stuff that costs 4 or less. And there's some cards that this is really good for. Unfortunately, it's a little slow since you've got to buy it first and then you can play it. It also has this problem where if you hit 5, now you got to choose whether you want to go for this or buy a 5-cost card, and often the 5 cost wins that war. There are, of course, boards where it's very good, but I think they're relatively rare. Relatively rare. Um, you got to keep your eyes open though. Like every now and then, talisman can be really, really powerful. They also stack, which is nice. So I don't know. You can play 3 talismans and gain 3 extra of some card. But I think like this is relatively uncommon that it's something I'm going to go for. Still, it is a nice way to delete piles every now and then. But yeah, I think it's more like a high C tier. It's not really any better than that. And next is going to be Loan. This might also be a hot take. I'm putting this in C as well. I think it's a very weak thinner. Only thins copper. Obviously, you can't get rid of your estates, which would be really swell. Copper is bad too, so it's good to get rid of that. Unfortunately, Loan has all kinds of problems. Like it can hit treasures that you want to keep. Is one of the biggest ones. So you want to get an index where you don't need treasure, but you probably need to get some treasure in a lot of games just to afford cards. And if you hit your silver over and over, then, well, Loan is a gamble that didn't pay off in that case. Unfortunately, yeah, it can also cause you to trigger bad reshuffles a lot. Just if it doesn't happen to hit a copper and it makes you reshuffle the deck and you can lose stuff. Yeah, obviously that can be a little complicated. Sometimes it can be helpful in that regard as well. But I think more often than not, I'm mad that I played Loan and missed my copper. This is what it feels like. It's not a completely horrible card. It's not D tier. It still is a way to thin copper, but I don't think it's particularly amazing. It's not a very exciting card. High C tier is about as good as I'm going to give it. Well, let's jump up then to the B tier with Forge, a very red card, you might have noticed. But yeah, Forge has the potential to be really, really strong. I mean, it can trash as many cards as you want from your hand, which is better than Chapel. Of course, Forge costs 7, so yeah, that's not going to be happening, and you do have to gain something. So it's really more like you're trashing everything -1. Now, there's a lot of games where you got to do some math toward the end and figure out if it's good to play a Forge and do something weird like, I don't know, gain a province. That's not really weird, but you gotta like trash some stuff you normally wouldn't to get it. Um, yeah, and a lot of times that's a little awkward because you do have to trash multiple cards with the Forge, and sometimes they're cards that you would like to keep playing, so you don't want to use Forge to get rid of them. But I would say like it's still decently strong. You can also use it to mill provinces and stuff like that. So yeah, like overall, it's a pretty good card. You just gotta like keep your options open with it. Unfortunately, it's expensive, and I just find like trying to hit 7 often doesn't pay off the way I want it to. But it's not impossible or anything. Still, yeah, pretty good card. Not massively powerful and not extremely weak either. It's pretty balanced. I like it. Next is Bishop. Bishop, I'm also going to put in the B tier. It can be very, very strong. You can get a lot of victory points out of this card. It does give you that coin, which is at least something to go with that, and thins a card. Unfortunately, it also gives your opponent the option of thinning, and this, of course, is not good. They can always take that option, and it can help accelerate their deck pretty quickly. There's been so many kingdoms where I've just ignored other trashers and let my opponent's bishop do all the work for me. Even at high levels of play, this has happened to me. So yeah, I think it can obviously be very good, but it can also be a double-edged sword, and so you've got to be careful with it. On the bright side, it's cheap, which is nice. And yeah, it can actually gain you a lot of points, especially if you're doing things like trashing golds. And there's the golden deck, of course, which lets you just keep playing the same hand over and over again. And Bishop is often involved with that. So yeah, it's a pretty good overall card, but it's got plenty of weaknesses. In other words, it's a great card. I love the design. Next in the B tier is Rabble. Oh, Rabble, decent enough terminal draw card. It's an attack, kind of. It makes your opponent discard cards that aren't victory or curses from the top 3 cards of the deck, and that's pretty good. It's nice if you can clump up a bunch of junk up there, although ironically that means that it was already there to begin with, so Rabble actually isn't doing anything. But regardless of what's happening, the more Rabbles you can play, the better, because
you'd really like to guarantee that they have a bunch of useless stuff at the top of their deck. So it's really good in games that run long with lots of green and stuff like that, as long as they don't have a way to use it. Generally speaking, though, it's just kind of an average terminal draw card. You're getting it more for the draw than you are the attack, I think. And that's really the only thing holding it back. Not really that it's even holding it back, I guess. So expand. Yeah, expand is B tier. Basically an expensive remodel. And, it's a little bit better than remodel, making stuff up to 3 coins stronger. It's obviously good. You can turn 5 costs into provinces into colonies, stuff like that. So yeah, all around, it's pretty strong. You can do a lot of the same stuff you do with remodel, with expand. It just takes you longer to get because expand costs 7. So yeah, sometimes hitting 7, not so easy. But, you can look back for my thoughts on remodel. I suppose you probably have thoughts yourself as well. Mint, I'm going to also place in the B tier. So arguably the most useful thing about it is that it trashes all of the treasure in play when you purchase it. So you can thin out a bunch of your copper kind of in one go, and that's pretty nice. But also arguably the best thing about it is that it clones treasure cards on play. This isn't so great with the basic treasures, but it can be very strong with alternate treasures, like obviously platinum, but any other alt treasure as well, like even something like supplies or, I don't know, fool's gold. That's something that's pretty decent to play your mint on there once you got your deck up and running. Nice way to gain extra payload. So it does both of those things. That's pretty good. Unfortunately, purchasing it can be a little bit awkward and swingy at times. And it is a terminal action that gives nothing other than gaining the treasure on play, so it's not like it's an incredible card, but overall it's pretty good. It's a card with strengths and weaknesses. It's B tier. Next is Watchtower, which is going to be at the high end of B tier here. Yeah, Watchtower is nice. It's a very flexible card. It fits into lots of different decks. Drawing up to 6 is not bad if you've got a disappearing hand engine going. You can also use its top decking effect to good effect, and it's a pretty good defense card as well. And it only costs 3, so yeah, it's rather nice and flexible. But yeah, never a game breaker, I don't think. You can't rely on it alone. You need to have like some kind of combo with it to make it very strong. And I think it's just B tier. Like there are other cards that draw more, and there are better defense cards out there. But yeah, overall, it's pretty versatile. Next is Quarry, which I think we might as well bump up to the A tier. Quarry is very, very good. It reduces the cost of action cards by 2, and it also gives you a coin, so it's kind of like it's reducing the cost more than that, sort of. Not really. With extra buys and gains, Quarry is much better. But, it's still pretty strong, especially if there's an expensive action. You could even open with Quarry to try and get it. But obviously it's also really good mid-game when you want to buy a lot of action cards. It's a nice way to reduce the price there. And unlike, say, Bridge, you don't have to play it as an action since it's a treasure. So yeah, it's pretty strong. I think sometimes people overdo it with them, but generally getting one Quarry is a reasonable enough purchase. Yeah. All right, City. Gotta also put City in the A tier. Obviously, it's an expensive village, but it does this thing where when piles run out, it becomes a very good draw card as well. If 2 piles are out, it also becomes coin and buy, but this is not usually going to happen, I think. So in a game between like 2 kind of high-ranked players, usually City won't get to level 3, or someone will take it to level 3 early because they don't fear the pile out because it's too early or something like that. So usually I would say like the plus coin and buy is an interesting thread, but not amazingly relevant because the game is pretty much over if it comes to that. If it comes to someone having a city stack and a bunch of buys and coins, then obviously that player wins more often than not. And yeah, cities, of course, are very, very powerful if that conditions happen. But what you really want with city generally is the level 1 city, right, where you're just drawing an extra card with city. that's very, very strong. It basically worth the investment as long as there's a pile that you can easily empty. Yeah, so overall it's very good. There's some metagamey stuff going on, but you don't care about that too much. Mostly you want it because it's a strong village. All right. Next is Grand Market, which not it kind of evades the S tier, I think, just because of the awkwardness in gaining it. Um, so yeah, you can't use coppers to buy it, which of course is a really interesting effect, and I really like it. Um, but there are ways to get around this. Obviously, alternate treasures are one way to do it. You can also use gainers like remodel, expand, or whatever to get Grand Market. I mean, there's all kinds of ways to get a Grand Market these days. So it's not like they're impossible to get, but you do have to have a good way of getting them, or Grand Market is very mediocre. If you're just buying them with silvers and golds, um, especially if you're not thinning coppers, usually that's a game where Grand Market isn't that great to begin with. Um, but yeah, in those big engine games where you can thin out your copper and buy this some other way, Grand Market can be really, really powerful. It just kind of narrowly avoids the S tier, yeah, because of that awkwardness in purchasing it. Yeah, I think Peddler is another one where it's definitely very strong, definitely in the A tier, but not quite an S. Peddler, of course, reduces in price from 8 coins the more actions you have in play. This is getting easier and easier to do with every expansion. So Peddlers are often very strong, and winning a bunch of Peddlers can often be game deciding, although, not entirely. So one of the nice things about Peddlers is that it does cost 8 coin before the buy phase, which means you can do stuff like remodel it or use other trash for benefit to turn your Peddlers into better stuff. But yeah, generally you want to keep them around because they're a nice little source of income for you. Not much else to say about it. Yeah, it's a very strong card, and it's very fun to rack up lots of them. And usually doing so is also very, very good. So yeah, Peddler is strong. Workers Village, another A tier card. One of the best villages in the game, I think. All it does is give a plus buy in addition to being a village. Only costs 4. That's a really good price for that effect. Plus buys are good. Villages are good. Workers Village is good. Not much to say about it at all. Well, I guess one thing to say is that it's pretty easy to pile out stuff with Workers Village just because it's doing 2 things that you really want at the end of the game. So you always got to be watching the piles when it's in play, and that's one of its strengths. Well, I guess we'll get to the S tier cards now. Obviously, these are the last 3, and here's the order that they are in the Thunder Dominion list. So there's Mountebank. Yeah, Mountebank is one of the best attacks in the game. Obviously, it does cost 5, and it can be a very frustrating card to deal with if your opponent manages to get it and you don't, and vice versa for them. So yeah, it gives 2 junk, curse, and a copper. It can be moded with a curse, and when the curses run out, it only gives out copper, which isn't the worst thing at that point. But suffice to say, getting 2 junk cards is just really, really strong. That can really, really hit you hard. Yeah, so Mountebank is always a pretty big threat when it's there, unless you've got a way to get around those cards or you want them for whatever reason. But those situations are exceedingly rare, and unlike a lot of cursors, it can actually be difficult to deal with the amount of junk Mountebank is giving you. So yeah, like the longer the game goes on, like Mountebank is still kind of keeping up as a cursor, even though there's lots of ways to get around curses. So very, very strong card. You should almost always be going for it. Okay, number 2 in the set is going to be Goons. Goons is, of course, just a completely busted card. It's amazing. It attacks, gives you money, gives you a buy, and you get victory points when you buy stuff. And they stack. So multiple goons means lots of victory points per purchase. This completely flips the game on its head and makes the game all about goons in like 90% of boards that have goons on it. You cannot ignore goons. It's maybe like 1% of games you can ignore goons, and it's just because there's something faster in the kingdom, like some kind of ridiculous combo. But yeah, generally speaking, though, you just don't want to ignore it. It's too good. And that's the reason it's S tier. Like the game revolves around getting to it and figuring out a way to win with it. So yeah, not much else to say. Like any plus draw and plus village in the kingdom is going to make goons like redonkulously good, and it was already pretty good on its own. So yes, I guess one weakness of it is that you can't get points for buying events, but it's a minor weakness, very minor weakness. Yeah, strong card. I guess one thing to say is that players will often too early start buying junk cards with their goons to get points, and more often than not, this is a mistake, and you want to hold off on doing that. I'm not really trying to give advice with these lists so much as just rank the cards, but I still see that happen to this day. Like decently leveled players will start buying coppers early in the game with goons, and I think unless you got a good reason, you should avoid doing that. So yeah. Finally, King's Court. King's Court's the best card in Prosperity. I think it's honestly close between King's Court and Goons, but yeah, King's Court is just pretty nutty. Tripling any card, any action card is basically always really strong. You can also double king, like you can king a king, and then you can play 3 cards 3 times, and you can keep on chaining it on and on and on. It costs 7, so that's a little awkward, but it's totally worth buying King's Courts as long as you have enough draw to support them, and King's Court helps you get that draw. So yeah, not much to say there. It just makes the game completely crazy, absolutely crazy. It probably says something that these 2 cards were part of the most broken combo in Dominion for a long time until it got removed from the game, which was King's Court Goons Masquerade. Yeah, it just goes to show you that the fact that those 2 were part of that combo should say something about their power a little bit. Yeah, you're always happy to have King's Court in hand with another action card, and you're always sad when it misses a target. Yeah, and that's about all there is to say about Prosperity. It's no surprise those are the top 3. Obviously, power level's a little bit over the board. There's a lot of weak cards in Prosperity, but oh well, it's an older set. What can you do? Well, I'll be back for the next one then.